Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about stakeholder buy-in. And with us today to discuss that is John Cray. John is a principal consultant here at Lifecycle Engineering. He's got over 35 years of experience working in the chemical process industry, man-made fibers, building products, facilities, and other processing industries. So John also works with within both public and private enterprises. He holds a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering. He is also a certified maintenance and reliability professional, as well as a Prosci certified practitioner. So, John, welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Glad to be here.
So, listeners, really quick, you'll notice that our partner in crime here, Tara Holwegner, is not hosting this episode today. She is out on vacation, lucky for her, but lucky for me because I have John here to pull up the ranks and just help us out, talk about stakeholder buy-in. So let's get right into the discussion. So, John, the first question I want to ask you about is, let's start out by talking about what is a stakeholder. So is this a person, a group, a complete organization? What is it?
Well, one thing that we're fortunate about is that the Project Management Book of Knowledge provides a definition on what is a stakeholder. And the simple answer is it's all three with broad affects. It can be an individual, it can be a group, and it can be an organization who may affect or be affected by or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or an activity or an outcome of a project.
What happens if we forego involvement of the stakeholder?
So on the project management side, one of the significant impacts could be extending a project schedule. A project that can go 20-30% longer, and then it adds extra cost. Likewise, not involving stakeholders at the appropriate time could require scope changes to a project. You may stay on schedule, but now you're having to do additional work, which brings in additional cost. In either case, it also can impact and delay the overall project, which ultimately delays the business benefit you're trying to derive from that project. The other part of the stakeholder analysis, if you don't do it right, is really, again, the people side of change. If you're not managing stakeholders with a good management plan, then you wind up reactively managing stakeholders. You start getting surprises. You start spending an additional amount of time managing unanticipated problems from individuals or groups within the organization, and that's taking time away from your project. Likewise, you may surprise some of your customers, which then causes delays in your project. And ultimately, you could even impact the community that we operate in. They could be surprised by something, which then creates additional stress on your project.
Okay. So what do project leaders need to do in order to engage with stakeholders?
Since stakeholders is a very broad term, as we just talked about, one of the first things you want to do is to create a stakeholder registry, identifying all the appropriate stakeholders associated with your project. For one, that could be the subject matter experts that you want to call upon for their judgment and expertise associated with your project. It could be some of your senior leaders in the organization who are funding the project or sponsoring the project. And it certainly can be affected groups or organizations. Certainly if it's a capital project, construction organization, or even a community at large.
How do you assess the needs of the stakeholder?
Well, again, you start with your registry. You identify the different groups or individuals that are part of that stakeholder registry. You want to identify as much quantitative information as you can get from the associated stakeholders. That is, hard numbers, hard facts, and document those by individual or by group. The second thing you want to do then is get as much qualitative information as you can from stakeholders, their opinions, their soft facts, concerns, and document those as well. And then lastly, you want to identify and assess the level of engagement associated with stakeholders. And it's ranged from how unaware they may be or how supportive they may be, and if they're even willing to take a leader role in helping with the project.
So now that you've conducted a stakeholder analysis, what do you do with all of that information?
Well, simply put, you need to develop a stakeholder management plan. You're going to assemble all that information, and you're going to develop a stakeholder management plan that contains 3 aspects. 1, a communication plan. 2, an information plan. And 3, a risk mitigation plan. With all the input you've received, feedback, and guidance, one of the things that you want to develop is an overall communication plan for your project. It's going to cover the full range of the phases of your project, and you're going to communicate at various times throughout your project. Additionally, you're going to identify that some information is required by different stakeholders at different times. And so what you want to do is put together a plan of providing the appropriate information to the appropriate stakeholders based upon the phase of the project that you're in. Lastly, as you have collected the feedback and the guidance and judgment of subject matter experts, you're going to identify some risks that you may not have been aware of. And so what you want to do is identify those risks, put them into your risk management plan, and then identify the mitigating actions to minimize that risk. In turn, you may involve some of your stakeholders in those risk mitigation activities since they brought it up to begin with.
So just to recap, you did the stakeholder analysis, and then you go right into the developing the communication plan, the information plan or requirements, and then the risk mitigation that comes third on that. Okay. Now I want to ask you a question with regards to stakeholder development or stakeholder. When you're working with stakeholders, you have Prosci, which is a change management. There's a change management methodology from Prosci, and so tell me about some of the tools and processes they have when it comes to stakeholders.
Well, when you've identified your stakeholders, as we talked earlier from the registry, some of your stakeholders are going to be sponsors and leaders of a change. If you're making significant change with a project and it's going to impact a lot of people, your leaders and your sponsors are going to also be responsible for leading and managing the organization change associated with your project. And so the difference between having a stakeholder management plan and some of the Prosci methodologies is in Prosci, you want to assess the competencies of the people involved in leading the organization change. Not everyone is experienced in leading and managing people change. They're good at capital project change, but not necessarily at leading people change. So you want to assess that competency and develop a sponsorship roadmap. Some of your other stakeholders are participants in the change, and they're going to use what Prosci calls an ADCAR assessment, where ADCAR stands for awareness, desire, knowledge, ability, and reinforcement. I always like to say, and Prosci teaches, organizations don't change, individuals change. Mm-hmm. And those ADCAR self-assessments is a way for individual participants of the change to identify their unique barrier to change. It's the leader's job to help that individual understand the need for change and to move through the change process. The ADCAR survey allows for that communication between employee and supervisor.
Interesting. Okay. And ADCAR, I'm glad you brought that up because we actually just talked about ADCAR in our last podcast with Tara. So it is something that definitely is a recurring acronym when it comes to change management, that's for sure. So,
and likewise, we talked about stakeholders and projects, but even in a big capital project, you're dealing with some type of organizational change. And it may be small, may be large, but what Prosci allows you to do using their sponsorship roadmap and ADCAR tools is to also deal with the people side of change, both as leaders and as participants.
Sure. Well, great. So I want to move into talking about the ISO 55000 standard and how that pertains to stakeholder buy-in and management.
So in ISO 55000, you're dealing with asset management. The specific thing there is you want to develop an asset management plan for whatever asset you're installing and operating. And part of that asset management plan is identifying your key stakeholders. One of the things that ISO wants you to have is an asset management policy, strategy, and management systems. So it's hard to work on your stakeholders if your organization does not have an asset management framework in place at just senior levels of your organization. Defining that policy is important for the organization, defining the strategies, and defining the management systems for assets then allows you to apply that to a specific asset management plan. In a specific asset management plan, you want to identify your key stakeholders, and these can be both internal and external. So in an asset management plan, you're going to identify your senior executive sponsor, your business unit leader, and if it's an operating plant, say the plant manager or production manager. Likewise, external stakeholders could be your suppliers and your customers, and possibly your utility companies as well.
So, John, one more question as we wrap up the episode. So how long are we actually working with stakeholders? Is it just during the project, or is it well after the project's been completed?
Well, in terms of stakeholder analysis and say a project, all projects have a defined beginning and an end. And if you're installing a new asset, then you're going to move from the capital acquisition and installation phases into the operate and maintain phase. And so the people involved in the O&M phase or the sustainment phase will continue to manage their stakeholders in that phase a little bit differently than you do in the project phase, if you will.
Well, John, I think that's going to do it for today's episode. Once again, thank you so much for joining the podcast, being such a great guest and knowledgeable guest about stakeholder management and generating that stakeholder buy-in. So just a kind of quick recap for the listeners out there. We talked about what a stakeholder is. It could be a person, a group, or organization. Most oftentimes, it's going to be more than just one person. How do you assess the needs of the stakeholder? We talked about how to engage and get the support through the stakeholder for the initiative. We explained how ISO 55000 is a part of stakeholder management. And then, we did talk about the Prosci methodology, ADCAR, for stakeholder assessment, and talked about a couple of those tools and processes. So yeah, thank you so much, John, and thank you, listeners, for tuning in for another episode. And be sure, don't stop right here. Be sure to go back to our show notes and look at all those additional resources we have on the topic of stakeholder management and stakeholder buy-in. So that'll do it for us today, and we look forward to the next episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's two ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.